What's the oldest living thing you've ever stood beside? There's a tree in this Brecon village which may have begun growing before the Romans entered Britain, before Christianity, before Wales even existed as a country. Potentially before much of the history that we think of as Wales had happened at all, and it's still alive, which is strange to think about, because normally when we go looking for the ancient past, we're looking at things that are dead, so like ruined castles, burial chambers, standing stones and things like that, and we try and reconstruct the people who left them behind. But here in Defynnog near Bannau Brycheiniog, there's something potentially from the ancient world that's actually left. It just kept growing, and depending on who you believe, this tree could be anything from around 2,000 years old to 5,000 years old. The second number is controversial, but we'll come back to that, because the more you look into this tree, the stranger the whole thing becomes. This is a Defynnog Yew, and the first thing worth saying is that it's absolutely massive. Its trunk measures somewhere around 11.5 meters around, and even though calling it a trunk feels slightly misleading, because when the yew reaches this sort of age, it doesn't look like trees we're used to seeing. It's actually hollow. Parts have died, other parts have grown around them, branches have become trunks, new growth has appeared from this ancient wood. It's almost less like one tree and more like a little ecosystem that somehow agreed to share the same name in the same place. And this is one of the reasons nobody can simply tell us how old it is. Normally, if you want to know the age of the tree, you count the rings, but ancient yews have an annoying habit of destroying all the evidence. The centre of the trunk decays, the oldest wood disappears, so the bit containing the first centuries of life may have vanished hundreds or even thousands of years ago. The tree's effectively eating its own birth certificate, and I like that, because humans are obsessed with knowing how old things are. We want numbers, dates, birth certificates, anniversaries, rankings. Britain's oldest tree, Wales's oldest tree, Europe's oldest tree, the oldest pub, the oldest castle. We can't just look at something ancient. We need to have a league table of what's oldest, rank them all. But this yew doesn't seem particularly interested in any of that. Parts of it die, other parts continue. It just carries on. Maybe that's why humans find trees like this slightly unsettling, because we're obsessed with linear time. The yew seems to regard all that as nonsense. This is where the Defynnog acquired a bit of modern mythology, because you sometimes see this old tree described as being 5,000 years old. 5,000. If that were true, then Stonehenge was being constructed. This tree may have already been grown here when it was, which is an extraordinary thought. But there's a problem. We don't actually know it's 5,000 years old. The claim became particularly interesting when genetic testing was carried out on 2 of these old yew trees. And the results showed that they were genetically identical, which created an incredible possibility. What if these 2 trees, what if they were the surviving remains of one massive prehistoric yew tree? Now imagine a gigantic ancient trunk occupying this whole part of the churchyard. Over thousands of years, the middle disappears, sections collapse. The surviving fragments continue growing independently. Eventually nobody remembers that they were ever connected in the first place. You come along thousands of years later and you think you're looking at 2 trees. But genetically, you're looking at 1. Now, unfortunately, there has been people that have said that isn't the case. They examined the trees and they later pointed out the positions of each tree. They don't really support the idea that it was once part of one single enormous ancient yew tree. Instead, though, something arguably stranger may have happened. One tree may have made another version of itself. Yew trees can reproduce through something called layering. A low branch reaches to the ground and connects with the soil. Eventually, roots start growing. Roots develop and they dig in, start growing from there independently. Over a long enough period, the original connection disappears and what looks like a second tree is standing there, but genetically they're the same organism. So it's possible that just one of the Defynnog yews essentially cloned another one. And this starts getting interesting and creating questions that probably shouldn't bother me as much as they do. Because is that another yew tree? If I grow another version of myself 5 meters away and eventually the physical connection disappears between us, which one is me? Both? Neither? Don't know. So at what point does one tree become 2 trees? There's an old philosophical thought experiment called Trigger's broom. Imagine you've got an old sweeping broom to sweep the streets. One brush head breaks, you replace it. One handle rots, you replace that. Eventually, well, both pieces of the broom have been replaced several times. So, is it the same broom? And if somebody had kept all the original parts and reconstructed another broom from that, then which one's the original? Clever man, whoever thought of that. So, how much of something can be replaced before it starts being something else? Human bodies replace cells, towns replace buildings, religions replace sacred spaces, and yet we give them the same names. Which leads us beautifully to this church, and it brings us to a really interesting question. What came first? The church or the sacred place where the church stands? Because the tree stands in the churchyard of St Cynog's, but the tree may be considerably older than Christianity in Wales. Even more cautious estimates allow for the possibility that the Defynnog Yew began growing during the Iron Age. That's quite a cautious estimate, but you know, it's still debated. Which means though that it could have been people walking past this tree 2,000 years before us, minimum. And we know this area was important long before the church building behind me. There's early Christian carved stones here dating roughly to the 5th or 6th centuries. One carries a Latin inscription, or possibly Ogham, a strange early Irish alphabet made up of lines and notches, that type of thing. So people were marking this place with Christianity a long time ago. But if the estimates for the yew are anywhere close, the tree was already here, possibly for centuries before that. And that's where it's very tempting to say that this must have been like a pagan sacred tree, because you see that claim made a lot in churchyard yews all over Britain. They'll say that the Druids worshipped here and then Christians took over. They took over the pagan sites and built churches beside the sacred yews. And occasionally, of course, that might have happened and probably did happen. But there's a problem, as we can't prove it here, so we're just left with the possibilities. And yeah, maybe this place was already considered sacred. Maybe it was like a marked burial place or a boundary, and maybe the early Christians then deliberately chose a place already important to local people. Or maybe the relationships between the tree and the church developed much later. We simply don't know. And there's something that is quite good about that, because sometimes mystery gets ruined by pretending that we've solved the problem. We don't like saying nobody knows, but sometimes nobody knows is an interesting answer. What we do know is that eventually this place became associated with a man called Cynog, and Cynog's story gets considerably stranger. Cynog was one of the sons of Brycheiniog. Brycheiniog, the semi-legendary ruler whose name survives in Brycheiniog, Brecon, the old Welsh kingdom that gave us the name Brecon. And Brycheiniog had an extraordinary number of children. Depending on which medieval tradition you read, the number varies wildly, which makes you wonder whether Brycheiniog was the actual father, or whether later Welsh churches simply discovered that attaching their local saint to an important royal dynasty round here was excellent medieval marketing. Either way, Cynog became one of the most important saints of this area of Wales. And unlike some obscure Welsh saints where virtually nothing survives beyond a church dedication, Cynog developed a substantial medieval cult. Gerald of Wales was writing about him in the 12th century, and Gerald mentioned something very peculiar. The sacred object associated with Cynog, a torque, an ancient neck ring or an arm ring, and tradition said that Cynog had received it from his father Brycheiniog. And this object apparently survived for centuries as a holy relic. Gerald claimed to have actually seen it himself, but later Welsh poetry turns this talk into something stranger, because according to local tradition, St Cynog actually fought monsters. A 5th century Welsh poem presents Cynog almost less like the saint we've recognised from Christian art, and more like a hero of Welsh mythology. According to the tradition, Cynog had once ruled in Ireland. He abandoned his kingship and returned to Wales, devoted himself to religion, and then discovered that people here were being terrorised by giants and monsters all around these mountains. So Cynog fought them, and his weapon was apparently this sacred torque. A holy man wandering around these hills of Breconshire, fighting monsters with his magical metal ring. That sounds fantastic, because saints' lives become very strange when you actually read into them and read into the stories behind them. We tend to imagine saints as quiet figures, standing behind stained glass windows that you see and looking mildly disappointed with everybody. But early Welsh saints, they inhabit a completely different world altogether. These are giants, dragons, curses, magic wells, animals behaving strangely, and mysterious objects, these type of things, and people having their heads cut off occasionally, continuing to walk around afterwards. Christianity arrived in Wales, but it arrived in a landscape already overflowing with stories and myths and legends, and sometimes those two worlds collided. The old hero doesn't disappear, it becomes a saint. The monster still remains a monster, but the weapon now used comes from heaven. Cynog himself, however, would eventually meet a violent end. Tradition says he was murdered, beheaded, actually. And afterwards, this place around here in Brecon would become one of the centres of his cult. A 15th century Welsh poem presents Cynog almost less like the saint we recognise from Christian art, and more like a hero of Welsh mythology. According to the tradition, Cynog once ruled in Ireland. He abandoned his kingship and returned to Wales and devoted himself to religion. And then he discovered that people around this part of Breconshire were being terrorised by giants and monsters. So Cynog fought them. And his weapon was apparently this sacred torque. So you got a holy man wandering around these hills of Brecon, and he's fighting monsters with this magical metal ring, which is great, isn't it? Because saints' lives become very strange when you actually read into them and read into the stories behind them. We tend to imagine them as quiet figures, standing around stained glass, looking quiet and disappointed, perhaps. But early Welsh saints, they completely inhabit a different world and different stories behind them. They're giants, dragons and curses and magic wells and strange animals, strange objects, these type of things. People having their heads cut off and occasionally continuing to walk afterwards. That's the story of Bran, which I'm definitely going to do a video on later. I've been planning that for ages. It's a great bit of history, that, and a great bit of folklore. But Christianity arrived in Wales, and already the landscape was overflowing with these sort of stories and legends, and they merged basically. The old hero doesn't disappear, it becomes a saint. the monster remains a monster, but now the weapon used to kill it is something from heaven, something given by Christians. And Cynog himself would eventually meet a violent end. Tradition says he was murdered, beheaded, and afterwards the place up there, the little town up there, became one of the centres of his cult. And now there's a prehistoric looking tree outside a church in this town dedicated to a saint who apparently wandered around Breconshire fighting monsters with a magical talk. And that's why I love researching these things. But this brings us back to the people of Defynnog, because their devotion to Cynog continued. Because Defynnog once held a traditional Gwyl Mabsant, a festival celebrating the local saint. And these festivals happened across Wales, and despite their religious origins, they weren't always necessarily solemn occasions. There could be fairs, games, competitions, food, lots of drinking, of course. We're in Wales. Basically, imagine a village fete where everyone has been drinking since breakfast, and half the activities have origins that nobody properly remembers. Defynnog's festival apparently lasted an entire week, and on the Monday they practiced a custom called carrying Cynog. You might reasonably assume that this meant carrying an image or an effigy of St Cynog through the village, but it didn't. Instead, they apparently selected either a stranger or someone locally who wasn't particularly liked, and they picked him up and threw him into the river, which is one of those traditions that raises more questions than answers. Like, how unpopular must you be to be picked up by your neighbours and just slung into the river here? And was there voting? Did people campaign for the most hated person? Like, I've known this guy die, and he's been a knob all his life, and he really deserves to get slung head first into the river here. Apparently this custom survived until 1822, which isn't that long ago really. Somewhere in Breconshire 200 years ago, people were celebrating an early Welsh saint by picking up someone who was unpopular and slinging into the river here. History becomes tidier the further away we get from it. They put everything into categories like Christian, pagan, folklore, historical fact, religion, entertainment, things like that. But people don't behave like that. They inherit these traditions through years, and sometimes they forget why they were even started. They can change them, add jokes, get drunk around the times they celebrate them, and eventually nobody remembers what the original thing meant. But they keep doing it anyway, despite that. And that's a little like the yew that we seen earlier. The original centre disappears and something living continues around the outside. Which brings us back to the question that we started with. How old is the Defynnog Yew? 5,000 years? Probably not. 2,500? Yeah, possibly. Nobody really knows. But if we take the more cautious possibility, imagine that this tree, imagine it's beginning its life in the early Iron Age, and since then Rome invaded Britain, Rome abandoned Britain, kingdoms appeared and disappeared, Brycheiniog rose, Christianity transformed Wales, people carved stones here, Cynog became a saint and stories grew around him. People came here carrying his relics. A medieval church was built. The Normans came, Welsh princes fought them, the Black Death, the Reformation. People stopped worshipping saints. People kept celebrating Cynog anyway. Villagers threw each other into rivers. Industry come and transformed Wales. Railways arrived, cars arrived, planes were overhead. 2 world wars, television, the internet, etc, etc, you get the point. And eventually some idiot arrived to do a YouTube video. But throughout all of that, this tree remained here, not unchanged, and that's the important part. It's completely changed. Branches have disappeared, the centre died, new wood grew. Parts of it may have become rooted elsewhere and turned into trees themselves. And perhaps that's the secret. We tend to think survival means remaining the same, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe surviving for a very, very long time requires becoming something different, but still remaining yourself. And maybe that's why ancient trees like this feel different from ancient monuments. The standing stone survives because nothing's happened to it, but the yew, it survives because things constantly happen to it. It breaks, it rots, it regrows, reproduces, loses a piece of itself and just carries on. And perhaps we'll never know why the first people protected the tree. Maybe it was sacred, maybe it wasn't. Maybe someone planted it, maybe not. Maybe the church grew around the tree, and maybe the tree simply survived because the churchyard protected it. At some point, memory disappears, and when human memory disappears, stories move in. Saints, magic talks, giants, holy relics, 5,000-year-old trees. And these stories accumulated around something that was here before any of them. And maybe that's the thing that I find most interesting. Not whether this tree is 2,000 years old or 5,000. Eventually those numbers become meaningless. And when memory runs out, what do we humans have? What have we always done? We replace them with stories. All while this tree keeps on growing.